Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I want to talk about how to prevent civil war. Now, the thing about civil war is that it is caused oftentimes by some division that occurs in society where the split between two parties in a society becomes so large that the ruling party and that a non-ruling party end up going to actual war rather than attempting to resolve the issues through non-violence. Now, there are two ways that can be used to essentially prevent a civil war. Now, the way to prevent civil war that is more commonly used is the method of emphasizing unity. The other one is trivializing division. Now, with emphasizing unity, the idea is that if the people in a state understand each other and come together as one people, that they are less likely to begin fighting each other, and that if they become reconciled with each other and that they come together, then they won't have a reason to fight because they are ultimately similar. Now, the problem with this method is that in between, there's a stage where the fight towards unity increases the marginalization of the non-ruling group to the point that it may in itself trigger a civil war. So ultimately, while this method can at times be effective, it at other times ends up accelerating the path towards a civil war. So attempting to eliminate the opposition is not always the best move. Now, the other system is to trivialize the differences. How do you trivialize the differences, you may ask? Well, it essentially means giving more liberty rather than moving towards authoritarianism, moving more towards decentralization as opposed to centralization. And what this creates is an effect where individuals, largely, if given their own determination towards social and economic policy, are less likely to go to war over issues, particularly if they themselves in their own communities are able to resolve those issues through nonviolence first. So what I'm essentially talking about is that instead of trying to centralize more power and to increase the power that the state has in order to crush potential opposition and to force reconciliation, what instead could happen is that the power of economic and social policy becomes decentralized communally to the point where in each local town, the people can then decide their own economic and social policy, which means that the common divisions that individuals are willing to fight over, which usually in terms of a civil war is resultant from some sort of oppression, are less likely to occur. Now, in addition to this, there should also be an idea of freedom of association and freedom of disassociation, so that essentially, if an individual feels that he is being oppressed by other elements in his community through the democratic process, that individual can leave and join a different community. Well, at the same time, if a community feels that letting certain individuals in would undermine the political balance of the community or would undermine the social fabric or would have negative economic effects, then the community would also be allowed to not let certain individuals in. This would create an effect where each community would be able to serve its own economic and social interests best, which is a commonly seen problem that some people point out with central democracy, where you have a potential of tyranny of a majority or mob rule, where one side of the country, which has different economic interests to the other side of the country, ends up being able to affect economic circumstances on the other side of the country, even if they might not be as beneficial there as they are in their part of the country. So, ultimately speaking, the centralization of economics creates a situation that will naturally produce tension, as economic policies will naturally not have an equitable effect upon the whole of a state. And also, there's problems of political polarization where individuals are likely to have completely different economic views depending on which part of the country they're from and depending on their economic circumstances. Now, an example would be that there are individuals that have more capitalist leanings and individuals that have more socialist leanings. And particularly the individuals that are more ideologically aligned. When it concerns capitalism, they might view socialist policies as being oppressive and harmful to the economy, and the socialists might view capitalist policies as ultimately being completely uncaring for the people and allowing for abuses to occur. Now, so ultimately, what we have here is a situation where both sides can view the other as being evil. And this is going to create a type of polarization. Now, instead, if we were to go with the decentralized system, then the capitalists and the socialists would be able to create their own communities, and through the process of free association and free disassociation, they wouldn't have to live in a situation where individuals feel like they are being oppressed by the economic policies of a government, which ultimately means that from a socialist perspective, looking at the capitalists, all the people that live in the capitalist communities are individuals that are happy living in capitalist communities. And from the capitalist perspective, individuals that live in socialist communities are ones that are happy living in socialist communities. Now, you may then ask, well, what about the economic effectiveness of these policies? And what if these policies end up actually hurting people? Now, when it concerns the harm that certain policies would cause to people, I, of course, believe that there obviously should be a standard set of defined crimes in every jurisdiction, such as murder, assault, rape, perjury, things like that, that would obviously be destructive to society or to the state, and therefore it makes sense that those are punishable crimes in every jurisdiction, and therefore that they would not have to that they should not be present in any jurisdiction, while at the same time giving each jurisdiction a bit of latitude in how exactly they will define these to some extent. But also, what I am essentially saying here is that by giving democratic ability to the local populace to decide these issues by electing whichever local government they choose to elect, what we end up with is a situation where they themselves are the ones that are responsible for the harm in their society. So if we ask, where does the buck stop? It does not stop at the top, it stops at the bottom. And therefore, we have to say that the communities have to hold themselves accountable for the actions that they take, unless there has been an abuse of a greater kind, such as allowing widespread rape or something like that, and the government being okay with it, in which case they would have to be held accountable by the higher government, which is elected by the lower governments. But anyway, going back onto the other idea, what if the economic systems don't always work? Because we know that there are different economic systems that have different paradigms and that view economic factors differently. And obviously, some people are going to be right, some people are going to be wrong. Not all systems are going to work equally well. Well, by creating a system where different communities are able to establish the exact types of regulation they want or that they don't want, what we end up is creating what I would consider to be a bit of a macro liberalism or a macro capitalism, where we end up with a situation where individuals will flee societies that are essentially using bad policies and therefore that do not work well, and that they will flock towards systems that are effective. So what we create is a, a political atmosphere where there is an emphasis on effectivity of political systems, and and we achieve this by allowing them to compete economically to see that certain systems are more effective. And of course, by allowing them to set their own economic policies, they will also be able to further their local interests. For example, certain societies might believe that it might be better to assert protectionist policies at certain points in time, or that perhaps free trade might be better in different areas. And it all depends on the economic interests. And since the people that are deciding all this are the people that are living all this, I believe that they are the best qualified to make such decisions, as opposed to people that are completely foreign to the situation who live on the other side of the country. Okay, so what does this have to do with civil war then? Well, what this creates is a situation where, since economic and social policies, which are very frequently things that have to do with potential civil wars, since such things are established locally, and that the people themselves have a voice over these things, populist revolutions, are not as likely to occur, because the people have an easy way to either advocate for change in their society or to leave for a different society that has already an effective system that they enjoy. So essentially, this would ruin the impetus for many different revolutions, simply by the virtue of essentially allowing for these compromises to happen that would prevent revolutions in the first place. Now, additionally, what this does is that it atomizes society in a way that puts different communities in competition, rather than having larger segments of a country, such as would be in, for example, the United States, where there's large states, and within the states there can be divisions, and there can be divisions between the states. But if you atomize it to hundreds of towns, what you end up is with a situation where there is unlikely to grow a large system of identitarianism, or a system of collectivism that has an us against them mentality that exists on a statewide scale. Essentially meaning that by dividing how these places are ruled, it also divides the potential opposition, therefore largely reducing the unity that any revolutionary movement would be able to gather. So by disuniting the economic and the social policies, it also disunites opposition to economic and social policies. And I believe that that would certainly be advantageous. Now, you might say, well, what about anarchists? Well, obviously, anarchists aren't going to like the system, because they wouldn't like any system. But I do have to believe that that's probably one of the few movements that this would not be as effective against, but certainly still probably more effective than more centralized democracies, in my opinion. Because at least in this sense, a lot of anarchist movements are based on establishing certain levels of liberty in society, that this system would allow them to at least approximate in some respect, therefore reducing the following that these movements would gather. However, actual complete ideological anarchists probably would not like the system, even though it is a lot more decentralized than what currently exists. Another would be um, centralized authoritarians. They probably wouldn't like it either, but they probably wouldn't be able to gather a lot of steam in this society either, for a similar reason as the anarchists, because uh, the people themselves would be able to solve problems in their society a lot more easily, which is a lot of the impetus behind authoritarian movements, is the ease with which problems can be solved through a centralized and absolute control, which would be severely diminished by the decentralized movement, because that would make it easy to solve problems, but in a different way. So essentially, although I do believe that a lot of movements should theoretically not be in opposition to this system, uh, the extreme authoritarians and the anarchists will probably still be in opposition. But I do believe that, from my particular perspective, it is important to have a central military force, and a strong state in that respect, so that external threats can be indeed dealt with, or that if there should arise a rebellion or a revolution, that it is also dealt with. However, I believe that any revolution that would occur in this system would be proportionately smaller than in any more centralized system, where partisan divisions therefore also become more centralized and more universal throughout the society, rather than more localized as they would be in my particular system. So tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree that decentralization would be a great way to prevent civil war? I do believe, in my particular opinion, that it would certainly be helpful, but I also believe that it is in the interest of every state to preserve its own existence, and therefore it makes sense that a state would want to prevent civil war. And even if it perhaps would reduce the power that a state would have over economic and social interests, I believe that doing so would be still a better choice than potentially risking the complete overthrow of a government. But that's just my particular opinion. So tell me what you think in the comments section below. If you would like to discuss politics with me, or anything that I said, I would be happy to do so. If you have something else that you think you would add, I would also be happy to do so. So please feel free to contact me more directly if you would like to have airtime on my channel and to discuss such things with me. Just be persistent, and I'm sure you'll reach me. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus Over and Out.